Great. Thank you, Josh. And it's really wonderful to be able to welcome Dr. Amy Thompson back to UNM virtually for her first post-graduation talk at UNM, probably the first of many. I met Amy first in 2008 when she was an undergraduate student at the University of Minnesota and attended the one and only UNM field school that I ran at Uxbenká in Belize. She then applied and joined the Department of Anthropology here as a graduate student and worked from 2009 then till about 2015 at Uxbenká before kind of focusing more intensively on her own project about 3 or 4 kilometers to the north of Uxbenká. She received an NSF dissertation improvement grant to support her dissertation research. She also has field experience as a student in Honduras, Alaska, Hawaii, and Romania, and a number of other sites in Belize. She's currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Field Museum in Chicago. She has 14 peer-reviewed articles, 7 of which she is either first or sole author on. And she is also beginning to start a position as an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the University of Texas at Austin. So obviously Amy's been keeping very busy. Her specialties are in settlement archaeology, looking at households, and in particular household inequality. And she does this often using tools of big data, including very large lidar data sets. So without further ado, she's going to talk to us today about land tenure, house size, and wealth inequality of the classic Lowland Maya. Thanks, Amy.
Great, thank you, Keith. Let me get the screen share going. And, all right. Keith, can you give a thumbs up that you can see the screen? See my slides? Super, thank you so much. So I'm gonna give 3 short disclaimers real quick before I start. One is that a few of you saw my cat beforehand, so he might come and make an appearance. His name is Harry. He loves Zoom meetings and Zoom presentations. So if you see Harry wandering around, hopefully it's not too much of a distraction. The second one is that they have recently started doing construction across the street from me, so hopefully there's not too much background noise of construction, but if there is, my sincerest apologies, a little bit beyond anything I can do about it. And third is that if my doorbell goes off, you will see me jump out of my seat because it's very loud. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but the last digital presentation I did, it did happen. So just want to give a disclaimer if that happens, just be prepared to see me completely startled. Without further ado, I will start. My talk is titled Land Tenure, House Size and Wealth Inequality of the Classic Maya, and it has been the focus of my postdoctoral research at the Field Museum of Natural History for the past 10 months or so. First, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional homelands where both the Field Museum is located, where I am currently situated in Chicago, and the many indigenous nations who call this place home, as well as acknowledge the indigenous groups who call New Mexico, and specifically the land where the University of New Mexico is located, call home. And finally, I want to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the indigenous Mopan, 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝗵𝗄𝗵, and also the historic 𝗦𝗲𝗄𝗵𝗵𝗀 Maya of southern Belize, where I conduct my research. A brief outline of my talk is that I'll be doing a short introduction, kind of discussing the ideas of what neighborhoods and districts are, as well as wealth inequality. Then I'll give a background of the Maya, as well as specifically southern Belize. I'll discuss my methods and how I look at house size, as well as a Gini coefficient and what that is and how we use it to look at wealth inequality, followed by results starting in the smallest area in southern Belize and then expanding out to how we can compare inequality within the Maya region and into greater Mesoamerica. And then followed by conclusion and then a Q&A session. I'm gonna turn on the laser pointer real quick, there we go. So my main research questions that I'll be discussing today are what can we learn from the ways in which inequality varied across different sectors of the peripheral communities in regard to power dynamics and wealth financing? And second, how does inequality manifest at the periphery of a cultural region as compared to its degree in larger, more central settlements? One way that we might think of inequality today in terms of house size is just what we can see in our communities. We can see how inequality manifests in terms of where people live today, and we can take these ideas and apply them to the past as well. So these are some houses from Albuquerque itself. This one here is a home in the Northeast Heights. I think it was valued at something like $3.5 million, as opposed to some apartments in Clayton Heights, which is just south of the university by CNM. And this, I believe, is the UNM student family housing. And so if we saw these two houses today, we might be able to take a guess that the folks living in, sorry, cat hair in my mouth, in this home in the Northeast Heights probably have more wealth and a greater income than folks living in these apartments where they're much smaller, they're compact, they're closer together, they're on a smaller plot of land compared to this large house up in the Northeast Heights. Likewise, we can use satellite imagery, or in this case, Google Earth, to look at some of these differences in how housing spacing and how big the houses are can be indicators of wealth inequality. So here, these again are both examples from Albuquerque. This is in the kind of Corrales area, the Los Poblanos estates, right by Los Poblanos farm. And you can see that there are these large plots of land with lots of greenery, lots of grass, and pretty big houses located on them. And on the same scale, just moving eastward towards the mountains, is this neighborhood of Bel Air. I personally had not heard of the neighborhood of Bel Air in Albuquerque before, but to give you folks a little bit of geospatial reference, it's basically north of Manal between Carlisle and San Mateo. And you can see that even at the same scale, these houses are much smaller, their land plots are a lot smaller, they're much closer together, more compact, a lot less green space. So just looking at these, we might be able to take a gander again that folks living near the Los Poblanos estates might have more wealth or greater income in this case than the folks living in Bel Air, just based on our knowledge of the societies that we live in and looking at the sizes of houses and sizes of land that people are living on and how compact or dense they are together. Our houses then are often clustered into groupings of districts and neighborhoods. And districts are these larger groupings of neighborhoods that contain some sort of an administrative function, and they're often larger spatially than neighborhoods are. So here's a map again of Albuquerque, where many of you are familiar with, where we have a breakdown of some neighborhoods, the east side, which I think most of us would actually call the Northeast Heights, things like Nob Hill, Uptown, but notably some of the ways that these neighborhoods are described are different than how some of us might personally describe these neighborhoods. On here, they don't have things like the International District, Edo, or the Silver Hill District. And even if we zoom into some of these neighborhoods, like the one that's Nob Hill, we know that there are sub-communities within these larger neighborhoods. So for example, in Nob Hill, it can also be broken down into sub-communities or sub-neighborhoods, if you will, of Monte Vista, College View, University Heights, etc. So neighborhoods are dynamic, they can change based on who's thinking about them, and they can in some ways be related to social identity. So when you think of someone who lives in Edo and maybe what the houses look like, maybe the types of jobs they have, that might be really different than folks who live in the university area or folks who are living up in the far Northeast Heights. We can think about these differences in terms of architecture and what that might mean for individual social identity for people living in these different neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are defined as houses that are near one another and that likely interacted face-to-face on a daily basis. So in your life, you probably will go down to the nearest grocery store or the nearest corner store if you have to pick up something like milk. That is something that's within your neighborhood. You're probably not going to travel all the way across the city to get something that you can acquire within your neighborhood. Districts are larger groupings of neighborhoods that contain district seats, and they have both administrative and high-status residential functions. So this relates to inequality and the idea of how houses are spaced and the size of them, in that a house may be large or small, as long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the little hut a palace, and all of a sudden that little house shrinks into a hut. And so here we have an example from Aladdin where you have houses that are all similar size, which you wouldn't notice a great deal of inequality until we add in the palace next to them. And all of a sudden there's this huge degree of inequality between the very large palace and these average size houses. So this relates to the Maya in the sense that when most people think of the classic Maya, they think of these types of architecture, the towering temples and the grand acropoli, such as that seen here at the site of Copan, temples 1 and 2 at Tikal, the Castillo at Chichen Itza, or the Pyramid of the Magician at Uxmal. However, this only provides perspectives into the 1% of the classic Maya society and doesn't give it a holistic idea of what classic Maya society was like. Therefore, I use settlement archaeology in order to gain a more holistic understanding of classic Maya society, or to look at the 99%, if you will. Settlement archaeology is the documentation of houses that are located in the hinterlands, both in relation to how big they are, where they're situated in relation to other houses, as well as the central core, and how they're situated on the environment. This is a map from the Classic Maya Center of Tikal, which has a very large core area here and hinterland houses documented all around it. Where I work in southern Belize, these classic Maya houses are often very small and ephemeral in the archaeological record. This is an example of a classic Maya house mound where I work at the site of Kuku'il. You can see that it's just a simple linear feature of rocks on the surface here that would have been the foundation of a house with a perishable superstructure. So this is a reconstruction of a house, of a classic Maya house at the site of 𝗔Ｈ𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗆 in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, where you can see this stone foundation that has wattle and daub walls and a thatched superstructure, which probably would have been very similar to the superstructure situated on top of this platform for just a classic Maya house. So these classic Maya houses can be very difficult to detect using things like remote sensing, and so settlement survey is a big part of settlement archaeology to gain this understanding of the dynamics and differences between houses and people living in the past, including how big were their houses, where were they located, and those sorts of things. My talk is mostly going to focus on the classic Maya, which are located in eastern Mexico, modern day Belize and Guatemala, as well as western El Salvador and Honduras. At the end of this talk, I'll also be comparing my findings and those from the greater Maya region with other Mesoamerican centers located in central Mexico and in Oaxaca. So a little bit of background about the classic Maya. The classic Maya are hierarchical society where you have a king or a 𝗤𝗎𝗆 within each of these different cities, and underneath them would have been people who were nobles, or what I like to call district heads. Underneath those might be intermediate elites or neighborhood heads, along with high status commoners, people like artisans and merchants, followed by commoners, or people who are farmers, basically sustaining and creating food for the vast majority of society. When we think of the classic Maya, we often think of this beautiful and elaborate material culture, including things like beautifully made eccentric shirts, wonderfully painted ceramic vessels like this one here, where you can actually see a king sitting on top of a throne, jade masks like this one from Pakal at the site of Palenque, and elaborately carved stela and monuments telling different sorts of histories and narratives of the past. However, among households, most of the households in classic Maya society, this is the type of artifacts that we find and that we're dealing with in order to understand these identities and differences between the people living within these houses. Things like obsidian blades, which are often small and broken, but indeed show long distance connections and trade happening because obsidian comes from the highlands of Guatemala. Broken pieces of figurines. This one is a ball player, and you can tell because it wears this helmet that is very specific to ball players, part of a ritualized ceremonial game played by the classic Maya and many other Mesoamerican cultures. Pottery sherds, which unlike this beautiful pottery vessel up here, our sherds are often small and broken. They might have some remnants of paint or slip on them, but they obviously don't frequently have these beautiful iconographic imagery that we see in some of these more elite contexts. And most of our stone implements are just simple chert or locally produced stone tools. So you can see the differences in material culture between the kings and the elites, nobles, versus the commoners and farmers, which is most of the sorts of artifacts that I deal with. We do know that the classic Maya elites were highly networked, and we know this based on the iconographic evidence left on different ceramic vessels. I'm going to show a series of ceramic vessels that are all from the Kerr collections. These are available for you to view and read more about on famsi.org. So if you just Google FAMSI, you can find more about them. The vessel number is located on each of these images. So here we can see some of these networked elites at different sites in this rollout of a vessel, where we have the ruler of Ik, or Motul de San Jose, sitting on a throne with a woven mat. He's wearing all the garb typical of a classic Maya ruler, and they are receiving an elite lady from Tikal or Dos Pilas based on an emblem glyph, which is located on this vase. So we know that there are these connections between elites from different cities. Likewise, here is another image of a Tikal lord sitting on top of a throne here, and they are they're receiving a messenger from Calakmul who is delivering a gift or tribute. And we know that they're delivering a gift or tribute by this overlay, where you can see this bundle that is tied to their back. And in classic Maya iconography and other Mesoamerican iconography, bundles like this one here are often used with a tump line and used to carry goods these long distances. So here we can see that the Lord of Tikal is receiving these goods from someone else from the site of Calakmul. Again, another example of this where we have a ruler seated here who is receiving gifts that were brought by this visitor who we don't know where this individual is from. It's not named on this vessel, but they have things like sacks of beans, textile bundles here, and possibly a cone of salt that is being brought in as gifts to this ruler. We also know that cacao was extremely important within elite contexts and among these different networked elites. Again, we know this from the rich iconography of the classic Maya, including things like this vase, which has a cacao tree on it, as well as an individual who's probably grinding cacao to make a cacao beverage of sorts. Cacao trees are very distinct, where their pods grow on the trunk and on the branches, and this is an example of a cacao tree in Honduras. And you can see these kind of very distinct looking pods on the cacao tree that we also see in the iconography from these classic Maya vases. And finally, we know that cacao is used in these elite contexts and is made into these frothy cacao drink beverages, as we can see here, and is consumed by the elites. So this helps give some ideas of the types of networks and relationships between the elites at these different centers, most of which that I just discussed here are in the central Patan, or kind of the core heartland of the classic Maya society. So the Maya culture, or Maya region, my apologies, is divided into 3 subregions generally, which are the northern lowlands, the southern lowlands, and the highlands. My work specifically focuses in southern Belize, which is kind of in the southeastern part of the southern lowlands. And it's about 150 kilometers from the central Patan heartland, which is located here in the middle of the Patan. The sites in southern Belize all date to primarily the classic period. They have a little bit of evidence of occupation during the late pre-classic, around 1 CE to 250, but the majority of these sites date to the classic period from 250 to 850 CE, with population and kind of large-scale abandonment happening thereafter. And there's small populations persisting until about 1,000, but not much evidence archaeologically for a large group of people living on that landscape thereafter. So zooming into southern Belize, there are more than 20 classic Maya centers located across this landscape, which is divided into 3 subregions, and that is the coastal plains, the foothills, and the Maya mountains. There are a series of rivers that kind of go from the northwest down to the southeast, and many of the sites in southern Belize are either located up in the mountains or in the foothill region. These sites that are on this map, are the ones that I'll be focusing on later in this talk: 𝗪𝗡𝗡 and Extrusion in the Maya Mountains, 𝗫𝗡𝗪𝗏, 𝗪𝗏𝗏, Lubantun, Uxbenká, 𝗔his𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗆, and Kuku'il in the foothills. Within southern Belize, there is a geologic feature called the Toledo Uplands, which has rich and fertile soils, and it's well known today for being able to grow cacao. So cacao is grown across the communities that live in this region today, and much of that cacao is actually used for export, for commercial export to different chocolatiers and chocolate companies. So we know that this Toledo Uplands, these soils are really wonderful for growing cacao, and also ancient cacao orchards are present up here, or modern cacao, wild cacao is present up here near the sites of 𝗭liche 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗄𝗆, which may be an indicator of ancient orchards being there in the past. Likewise, there's a trade route that passes from the Caribbean Sea and goes up the Rio Grande, going by Lubantun and passing through the site of Uxbenká into the southeastern Petén that would have facilitated trade within the region and going from bringing goods from the southeastern Petén eastward and goods that would have been carried through the sea westward. We think that Uxbenká may have been settled here in part because it's located on this trade route to move goods, especially during the early Classic period. So zooming into the sites of Uxbenká and 𝗔his𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗆, which was the focus of my doctoral dissertation research and where I have been continuing to look at during my postdoctoral research, there's nested scales of community, going back to those ideas of neighborhoods and districts, where here we have a map of Uxbenká and 𝗔his𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗆, where each household or plazuela is identified by a colored circle or colored dot, 𝗔his𝗁𝗵𝗿𝗆 in orange and Uxbenká in blue. And these are clustered, discretely clustered into neighborhoods, which are circled in red, as well as larger districts, which again, or I'm sorry, circled in black, and districts that are circled in red. And again, districts have some sort of administrative function or high residential household within these district centers. So districts, 𝗔his𝗁𝗁𝗆 has 5 districts, while Uxbenká has 3. And neighborhoods, 𝗔his𝗁𝗁𝗆 has 16 neighborhoods and Uxbenká has 20. Notably, all of Uxbenká's districts are situated along this trade route that I spoke about in the previous slide that goes from the Caribbean Sea inland to the southeastern Petén. And so all these districts are located right on this trade route, which was modeled using a least cost path analysis and is discussed in the ethnohistoric literature. Zooming out a little bit, we'll also be discussing household inequality and wealth inequality at the level of the polity, including both Uxbenká and 𝗔his𝗁𝗁𝗆, as well as these 6 other centers in southern Belize. I'm only doing these 6 centers because that is where we have settlement data for in order to look at house size. Many of these sites just have a quick map made of them, but they don't have any data or information on the houses or settlements surrounding them. So the analysis of southern Belize is based on sites that have settlement archaeology. So in southern Belize, there are 8 sites total. I'll then expand this out to look at a total of 17 sites in the Maya region. All the other sites in the Maya region, as well as greater Mesoamerica, is from other published literature, which is cited in each of the slides. And then zooming out even more to greater Mesoamerica and comparing how the Maya region compares to cities in central Mexico and Oaxaca. So to look at house size and wealth inequality, I use something called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a portion of cumulative sums, where you take the portion of the population and compare it to the proportion of wealth. If everything is exactly equal, it will fall at a 45-degree angle along this line of equality. The Lorenz curve is a visual representation of the portion of cumulative sums. So in this situation, you have many houses that are fairly small, and you have a few houses that are significantly larger. The Gini coefficient then is a number, which is a numeric representation for the area underneath this Lorenz curve. The Gini coefficient ranges from 0, which is representative of less inequality or more equality within the sample, and 1, which is representative of more inequality or less equality for the sample. Something that is important here is that Gini coefficients should be compared between similar data sets. So in this case, I'm only using house size and sites that have, for southern Belize, settlement data to calculate a Gini coefficient based on house size, as well as comparing Gini coefficients for house size across the Maya region and Mesoamerica. You can use a Gini coefficient to look at inequality based on things like artifacts or tomb size, but comparing it to house size might have some issues. So I'm only comparing Gini coefficients of house size in Mesoamerica. So to look at the Gini coefficient, just to give a quick example, this would be an example of perfect equality where you have this handful of households that are all exactly the same size. So the Lorenz curve is actually underneath this line of equality here, and there's a Gini coefficient of 0. For high inequality, you have many houses that are the same size and fairly small, and one house that is significantly larger. So in this case, there's a Gini coefficient of 0.92, where you have almost all the houses very small and one house that is extremely large, creating a fairly large area underneath this curve of the Lorenz curve. And then we have other examples of kind of more equality. The houses are a little bit more similar, and more inequality where you have a few houses that are larger than the others. And in these examples, the Gini coefficients are 0.33 and 0.56. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Adrian Chase, who provided the Excel spreadsheet in order to create these Lorenz curves. Thank you, Adrian. So in terms of house size and being able to look at house size at the sites that I work at, this is just an example of kind of on the ground what these houses look like. I showed a picture of this earlier in the talk, but oftentimes it is these very ephemeral remains of linear features of rocks where there typically would not be rocks. So here are just some examples of very small houses, as opposed to some examples of larger houses. So this is a mound of rocks right here where there's an excavation unit on top. So this is a little bit larger house. And again, another pretty large feature over here. This is actually a minor temple. But you can see these differences in terms of what these houses look like archaeologically, from fairly large houses to very small houses. Just for another comparison, this is an elite residential area at the site of Copan, and this gives an example of what some of the elite houses look like in other parts of the Maya region, specifically in Honduras in this situation. And then again, these show the perishable superstructures that likely would have been on top of each of these small platforms. So when we think about this, we can think about how these smaller houses, in this case, this very small platform, might be something more akin to these very close and compact apartments, while larger household groups might be more like this home in the Northeast Heights in Albuquerque. So we can think again of the differences in house size that we see today in the societies and cities that we live in, and how that might translate to how we can interpret things of the past with smaller and larger houses. So to study house size, classic Maya are often situated in what is called a plazuela group, where you have several different buildings situated around a central plaza. In southern Belize, these often occur on discrete hilltops, and the hilltops are often modified or built up in order to expand the hilltop area, or where the plaza can be, for these day-to-day activities. So there are three ways that we can kind of calculate house size based on knowing where these plazuelas are and where the houses are. One would be looking at individual residential structures, so all of the structures across the site. Another way would be the total of all structures within a plazuela group, so kind of the whole effort of a family in order to build their living space. And then finally, the entire plazuela group, which includes this effort needed in order to build up these plazas. So I use primarily total of all structures within plazuela groups for the greater southern Belize example, and for Uxbenká and 𝗭ощ Kuku'il when talking about neighborhoods and districts, because we have lidar data which allows us to calculate this volume, I use the entire plazuela group. So jumping back to the research questions, what can we learn from the ways in which inequality varied across different sectors of a peripheral community in regard to power dynamics and wealth financing? These are the results of neighborhood wealth inequality at Uxbenká and 𝗭ощ Kuku'il. You can see that there are some instances of high inequality. This is likely due to fiscal financing through cacao and other luxury goods. As I spoke about, cacao is grown easily in this region, it's grown abundantly, and it probably was the same during classic Maya times as well. So we think that one reason why there's high inequality, even within these small neighborhoods, may be because of the growth and production and trade of cacao. And that there were network deletes, and that this fiscal financing or goods were able to trickle down from the rulers of these sites to district heads to even neighborhood heads. However, we also see that there are some instances where there's low inequality within these neighborhoods. So there's some variation. Not every neighborhood has high degrees of inequality. There are places that have lower inequality as well. And finally, we see that there's high inequality outside of the neighborhoods. And so this might be an idea of the replication of the core, or these areas very close to the civic ceremonial center, that's happening even on the outskirts of these settlements. In terms of the districts and district wealth inequality, this one is from 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃, and the different size dots are representative of the volume of the different plazuelas. So blue dots are the largest households, and red dots are the smallest households. So you can see that the households, in terms of the large ones, they're kind of dispersed across the site. They're not all clustered together in the same place, but that we have larger households with smaller households surrounding them. So in terms of the districts, District 1 has the highest inequality, and it was established fairly early on in the occupational history of 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃. It was established by about 400 CE. Districts 2 and 5 also both have fairly high inequality, and notably District 5 is right here on the boundary between the two sites. So this might be something of importance, as the occupants of 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃 were building larger houses on the edge here, kind of as territorial markers. And finally, Districts 3 and 4 seem to have the lowest inequality within them. We also note that there's higher inequality near this trade route. This is a trade route that was modeled using a least cost path analysis, going from Group A at 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃, which is the primary civic ceremonial core, to the Market Plaza Group D at Uxbenká. And finally, just like with the neighborhoods, we see that there's pretty high Gini coefficients even outside of districts. So again, this idea of the replication of the core even within the periphery. At Uxbenká, we see some similar trends where District 1 has the highest inequality. Notably, it had massive landscape alterations by about 300 CE, specifically in the civic ceremonial core of groups B through G and Group A. District 2 has high inequality. It also has very large landscape alterations by 300 CE in the elite residential area in District C of District 2, located in Plazuela 25. And District 3 has the lowest inequality of the districts at Uxbenká, and its monumental constructions occurred a little bit later, about 100 years later, around 400 CE. Notably, all of these districts are established along a trade route, which may explain why there is such high inequality at all three of these districts. And again, there's replication of the core in the periphery, where we have pretty high Gini coefficient outside of these districts. And we can see that there are a few large houses not located in districts themselves. However, several of these houses are fairly close to that trade route, which may help explain why there's high inequality exterior to the districts at Uxbenká. Another thing that is notable is that there's some variations in terms of how inequality plays out at the neighborhood level versus the district level. The neighborhoods have greater variation in terms of their inequality. This might be in part due to the sample size of neighborhoods, which are quite a bit smaller than the districts, and also that there's more variation in the wealth inequality of the 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃 sample than the Uxbenká sample. You can see that the Uxbenká sample is a little bit more clustered, and the 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃 sample is a little bit more varied, both for the districts and for the neighborhoods. So how does this relate to land tenure? We can look at the gradual development of these sites and see how inequality might be related to land tenure, especially at the district level. So during the late pre-classic, or from about 100 BCE to 250 CE, Uxbenká has a handful of households, notably again, all located right near the trade route, while 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃 only has one household, which is located pretty close to the border or boundary between these two sites. During the early Classic 1, from 250 to 400 CE, there's a massive population growth that occurs at Uxbenká and very little growth occurring at 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃. During the early Classic 2, from 400 to 600 CE, there's some population growth at both sites, nothing too substantial, as compared to the late Classic when there's kind of this demographic boom at both of these sites, where you just have this huge population expansion, and this is true in southern Belize in general. So we can start thinking about land tenure and the fact that Uxbenká and 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃 as entire polities have fairly similar Gini coefficients, and 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃 is actually slightly larger than Uxbenká, but Uxbenká was founded several centuries earlier than 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃, suggesting that land tenure, or when these sites were initially founded, isn't playing into wealth inequality the same way that we may have expected at the polity level. However, at the district level at Uxbenká, we can see that the two districts, 1 and 2, that have large monumental constructions a little bit earlier than District 3, do indeed have higher wealth inequality. So in this case, it might be that there's larger populations living in Districts 1 and 2 a little bit earlier on, and the district heads are able to gain a grasp on the control of resources, which enhances their wealth and their wealth inequality. And then going over to 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, we see this similar trend where the districts that are founded a little bit earlier, District 1, 2, and 5, have higher wealth inequality than the two districts that are founded a little bit later, Districts 3 and 4, which have lower wealth inequality. So it looks like land tenure may play into wealth inequality within centers themselves, especially at this district level, as compared to the polities as a whole. We can then take this and compare it to what's going on in larger southern Belize at these 6 other centers, 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗄𝐿, 𝗓𝗔𝘁𝗵𝗵𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, and 𝗏𝗏𝗏. We can look at the chronology of these sites and see if this pattern holds true as well. So these are ox cow curves from radiocarbon dates. The colored bars on the bottom are ceramics that tell us kind of when the site may have been used based on ceramics. And the vertical lines are inscriptions or dates based on both stela or different sorts of material culture. So some of these sites have stela that have dates on them. Other sites don't have any dated or carved monuments. But this gives us, using 3 different proxies, ceramics, radiocarbon dates, and hieroglyphic dates, provides an idea of the occupation of these 8 different sites. So 𝗔𝗁𝗃𝗃𝗃𝗃, Uxbenká, 𝗏𝗏𝗏, 𝗓𝗔𝘁, and 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗏 were all founded by the early Classic and persisted through the late Classic. 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗄𝐿, Lubantún, and 𝗔𝗏𝗃𝗏, though, are only founded really during the late Classic period, sometime after about 700 or so. So how this relates to our Gini coefficients, I used the settlement data from several published papers and works in order to calculate the Gini coefficients based on house size for these 6 other centers. And we can see that there's some variation where 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗏 and 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗄𝐿 have fairly high wealth inequality compared to 𝗏𝗏𝗏, which has fairly low wealth inequality. Part of this might be 𝗏𝗏𝗏's sample size is fairly small. There's only about 6 plazuelas, whereas all of these other sites have about 50 or more plazuelas, anywhere from 50 to 180 plazuelas. So some trends that we can see are that the early Classic sites, there's some variation in terms of wealth inequality, where 𝗏𝗏𝗏 is established by the early Classic, but has fairly low wealth inequality. And that the sites that are established during the late Classic still maintain fairly high wealth inequality, specifically here at 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗄𝐿. So it seems like earlier founded sites do not necessarily translate to having higher Gini coefficients or greater wealth inequality within the population at the polity level. And likewise, longer occupied sites don't result in higher Gini coefficients. So again, here, 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗄𝐿 is probably only occupied for 200 years or so, and it has fairly high wealth inequality. And likewise, 𝗵𝗡𝗡𝗄𝗏, which is occupied for several hundred years, from about 400 until 900 or so, has a pretty similar Gini coefficient. So longer occupied sites also don't necessarily mean higher Gini coefficients. We suspect that this might be due to, again, this idea of exclusionary networks, where elites were able to maintain control over the distribution and trade of certain goods, and probably something like the export of cacao, which we know grows very well in the region. Imports that we know exist are things like jade, which comes from the Motagua River Valley in Guatemala, imported ceramics from the Central Petén and from the Belize River Valley, based on recent work by Dr. Jillian Jordan, obsidian, which comes from the highlands of Guatemala, as well as the highlands of Mexico, conch shells, which come from the Caribbean Sea, and textiles. We suspect that there were likely many textiles at these sites. They're perishable, so they're no longer preserved, but we have very few spindle whorls indicating the production of these textiles, so we think that they may have been imported. So we suspect that these high degrees of inequality at these southern Belize sites may be that elites were exporting goods like cacao and importing these other sorts of material culture. I did a least cost path analysis with the help of a UNM undergraduate, Marina Lemley, and we did a least cost path analysis between these different sites in order to look at how these sites may be interacting with each other. This is extremely preliminary, and the goal of this is to do a social network analysis between the sites, which I haven't had time to do yet, but a few trends kind of stick out, and one of them is that all of these sites are located in the foothills, but people are frequently passing right along the edge of the foothills and the coastal plains, which may be one reason why 𝗵𝗟𝗶𝗏𝗏 has high wealth inequality, is that people coming from Uxbenká and Kuku'il and Lubantún were coming down and passing through here, stopping by 𝗵𝗟𝗶𝗏𝗏, and then 𝗵𝗟𝗶𝗏𝗏 was continuing to trade goods up the coast. So just a hypothesis, a working hypothesis that I'll be diving more into later. But just also an idea of how these exclusionary networks may be helping to manifest this higher wealth inequality in southern Belize. So we know that communities mediated trade and that they have higher Gini coefficients, and that there's access to luxury goods through these exclusionary exchange networks. We see different types of luxury goods specifically, for example, in the districts of Uxbenká. Likewise, Uxbenká and several of the other centers in southern Belize have connections with larger centers. I'm going to specifically talk about Uxbenká here, and we know this based on different types of hieroglyphs that are located both on the Uxbenká stela and on stela from Tikal. So in this instance, there's a jaguar name that appears both on stela 39 at Tikal and on stela 11 at Uxbenká, and a toponym that is present on stela 31 at Tikal and stela 11 at Uxbenká, indicating that there's some sort of connection between the elites at these sites. Exactly what that connection is remains a little unclear, but it lets us know that these people were in communication with each other in some way. So at the district level, communities with long-standing households had higher Gini coefficients, and we suspect that this might be because of the rise of Uxbenká during the early Classic period, which coincides with the same time of the rise of the Central Petén polities like Tikal, and that there was an increased demand for luxury goods, specifically things like cacao, for these different sorts of rituals that we know were happening in Classic Maya society. We also suspect that there's an intergenerational transmission of wealth through occupational priority. So going on to the second research question, I know I'm running short on time, but I'm almost done. How does inequality manifest at the periphery of a cultural region as compared to its degree in larger, more central settlements? So if we expand this out, these are Gini coefficients for house size that are published in other scholars' works. And we can see that they're pretty similar in terms of there's not huge variation for the Gini coefficients, but also that these are pretty similar to what we saw in southern Belize, ranging from about 0.4 to 0.6 or 0.7. So even though these sites like Tikal, which has these massive pyramids, and Palenque and Cacao, which again has these massive monumental architecture and are located kind of in this more central region of the Maya region, they have equally high Gini coefficients as southern Belize. So that's important. And one reason why this may be, again, is looking at these networked elites. And we know that the elites in the Maya region were extremely networked. This is based on a hieroglyphic database and a publication by Munson and Macri from 2009, which looks at the networks and relationships between elites from these different centers within the Maya region. So we can see that people are interacting with each other all the time during the classic period, which might be why there's this high wealth inequality across many of these Maya centers as people are trading and interacting with one another. And that this even occurred down in southern Belize, where there might not be quite as many hieroglyphic connections, but archaeologically we can see these connections existed. Likewise, using a network analysis of obsidian, we can see that the sites in southern Belize are very integrated into these different networks. The sites including Uxbenká, 𝗭𝗏𝗏, and Lowland have connections with many other classic Maya centers, especially when compared to some of these other Maya centers like Copan and 𝗭cie_𝗾𝗂𝗆, which are located down in the southeastern periphery. So Uxbenká, Lowland, and 𝗭𝗏𝗏, based on their obsidian, are very connected to the Central Petén and the greater Maya region. So expanding out to greater Mesoamerica, if we compare the Maya region to both central Mexico and the Valley of Oaxaca and the different sites there, and again, published Gini coefficients, we can see that the mean and median are quite different for Gini coefficients between the Maya region, which has a mean of 0.55 and a median of 0.57, compared to the 5 sites in central Mexico, which have a mean and median of 0.26 and 0.30, and in Oaxaca, which have a mean and median of 0.36 and 0.38. So the classic Maya sites have greater wealth inequality based on house size than their counterparts in Oaxaca and central Mexico. We think this might be because the Maya are a more autocratic society and that the elites were connected through exclusionary networks, and that in Oaxaca and central Mexico, these societies and these cities were a little bit more collective. So you didn't have a single elite ruling over them in the same way that we see for classic Maya society. Likewise, we can break these apart. Instead of looking at regionally, we can look at forms of governance, and we can see that more autocratic groups, which include the classic Maya sites, have higher wealth inequality based on these Gini coefficients than more collective sites or places with more collective forms of governance, which include those from Oaxaca, central Mexico, and the post-classic Maya site of Mayapan, which is underneath that point right there. So the key results of this study are going from the large data set all the way down to our neighborhoods are that more autocratic states have higher degrees of inequality than more collective states based on those examples from greater Mesoamerica and comparing them to the Gini coefficients in the Maya region. These autocratic states of the classic Maya are likely financed through exclusionary exchange networks with less reliance on local populations for revenue. There's high degrees of inequality in southern Belize, and this is likely due to the elite control of resources such as the export of cacao or control of trade routes. Specifically, we saw that at Uxbenká, and due to things like occupational priority or land tenure within the districts. So land tenure impacts inequality is specifically at local scales in the districts, but we don't see that trend necessarily at polity-wide scales. This would be a wonderful question to continue looking at in the greater Maya region as well. And we see that finances trickle down to nested scales within a community, that it wasn't just that the polities had high inequality, but within districts and neighborhoods, there was fairly high inequality, suggesting that vertical networks existed between the elites of these classic Maya societies, all the way down to things like neighborhood heads. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was fascinating. And we will take questions now. So anyone who has a question, feel free to just unmute your video and go ahead and ask your question, since we don't have any in the chat.
And I'm just going to stop my screen share if that's okay with folks.
Thank you, Amy. That's a fantastic presentation. I'm from the Pueblo of Santo Domingo, and this would be a fantastic comparison with your study and Chaco Canyon, the Southwest region. A study doing this would enlighten us into different ideas. Like I wrote down about 6 or 7 questions. Were there any clanships there? Yeah, I'm talking about social anthropology. Large houses meant that the wives and the husbands had lived longer, so the children build them houses through clanships. And the first marriages, the new ones, always got the smaller houses and they worked themselves up. And talking about migration theory, there was a lot of intermarriages going on. So, and also trading. We have trading routes here, and they also have trading routes. That'll be another interesting study, and it's fantastic. I'd love somebody to do that comparison, you know, do a study like that. Thank you.
So for the US, thank you for those comments and the wonderful question. Specifically for the US Southwest, folks have done the same type of study looking at house size and Gini coefficients and wealth inequality. I think it's specifically Dr. Timothy Kohler has done some work on that. And so I'm happy to email you some of those papers that I have been reading to kind of gain a better background and get a more holistic perspective of these ideas across the world and how people have used house size to look at inequality in past societies all over the world. But folks have done this in the Southwest, looking at the greater Mesa Verde region, as well as Chaco Canyon, I believe. So, yeah.
We
Hi.
have another.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to jump in. I just have a quick question. Thanks so much for a really illuminating talk. I was just curious, I had a question about some of the preliminary work you showed between the connections between the different sites. And I was wondering how you infer paths of contact between the different places.
Yeah, so those paths that I showed where it's a bunch of kind of interconnected paths, that's using a least cost path analysis. And I specifically followed Devin White's 2015 paper to use a Tobler's hiking function, which is a fairly common way for people to look at least cost paths in terms of not just the amount of effort to go somewhere, but kind of the amount of time as well. So that takes into consideration the slope or the topography of the landscape that you're walking across. And so those least cost paths that I showed are based on a Tobler's hiking function least cost path analysis. And as you could see, I did them from each site to every other site, so it's fairly complex. But I think doing a social network analysis on those least cost paths will really help kind of key in on those relationships and dynamics between the sites of southern Belize.
Thanks. Thanks so much.
We had a question from T. I don't know if they want to ask the question. If so, go ahead. If not, I can ask it. I'll go ahead and ask it. It was, I think the question is, with the comparison, was it just house sizes or also artifacts found taken into consideration?
So for my work, I have specifically focused only on house size, and when comparing the Gini coefficients between the Maya region and greater Mesoamerica, it was only using Gini coefficients for house size. Other scholars have looked at artifacts, and we included we have like a qualitative discussion of how artifacts play into this, which I didn't include in this talk because it was already pretty full of information. But you can do a Gini coefficient and look at this degree of inequality of artifacts if you have a large enough data set, which other scholars in both the Maya region and Mesoamerica have done. I just had opted not to do it because you can't really compare Gini coefficients of artifacts compared to house size. You'd want to be comparing Gini coefficients of artifacts to other Gini coefficients of artifacts at other sites. So to kind of level the playing field there, I only discussed house size here.
Hi, Azia, you're muted. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. I really enjoyed this. I was wondering, another fairly common approach is to try to figure out the labor costs in producing a structure and then compare those. And it strikes me that for the Maya area, there might be a huge difference between a wooden house with thatched roof versus a stone house, and especially a stone house with stucco and thatched roof. And I wondered if those were incorporated, does that change the picture, or how significantly might it change the picture if you could turn that into like hours of work or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so other scholars have definitely looked at labor cost. One of the advantages of focusing specifically on southern Belize right now is that we don't have any masonry superstructure. So we don't have any of those kind of corbel vaults that you see in other parts of the Maya region. So we decided not to include labor effort for this particular part of the analysis, because all of the houses, as far as we know, had perishable superstructures. That is something that I've been talking with some colleagues about, though, is how do we incorporate that difference? Because like you said, building masonry superstructures is going to take a different amount of effort than perishable superstructures. And same with putting stucco on and things like that. So I did not include that here, but that is definitely a great idea for future work, especially in places where you have that variation in architectural styles that we don't have in southern Belize.
I've got a question actually, along the same lines as the last two questions. Having worked somewhere in the highlands in Peru, where especially in the highest areas, people do have buildings that have a stone foundation and plant matter as the superstructure. Those buildings often look the same, but they get used for different things. Some of them are storage, some of them are hearths, some of them are sleeping areas. And then there's bigger ones sometimes that get shared by different people for different reasons. And I'm not an expert on that, but I'm curious how, when you look at these, if they're all sort of equivalent in use, or if maybe multiple families are using larger ones, how you sort of sort that out, because it seems like a measure of social inequality and wealth also depends on the patterns of socialization in between families and with the built environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that we really went through when doing this analysis, and that is that in classic Maya society, kind of across several different scholars have said this, that anything underneath 20 square meters is probably not a domicile. It's something that's more like an outbuilding, a storage facility, or something like that. And anything over 275 meters squared is not residential in nature. According to Norm Hammond, 1975, he did some of the earliest kind of settlement work in southern Belize. And so he's the one who kind of defined those sides for individual structures, what might be considered residential is anything from 20 square meters to 275 square meters. So when I showed that image of the classic Maya plazuelas and it had individual structures by plazuela and entire plazuela, if we were to look at individual structures, I eliminated anything underneath 20 square meters and anything over 275 square meters. However, what I think is probably a better indicator of family groupings is the entire plazuela, where you have usually one or two buildings that are residential in size, if you will, and then you have a couple of buildings that are significantly smaller that, again, were probably these outbuildings or storage facilities. So we have interpreted in southern Belize the plazuela to be a specific household unit. And in part, that's because these are located on kind of discrete hilltops. They usually contain anywhere from 1 to 8 buildings, but generally 3 or 4, which is what we would expect for a single household family unit. So that's kind of how we teased out some of those differences. And that, again, might vary when you go to other sites across the Maya region, but oftentimes classic Maya houses are situated in a patio group or a patio cluster with several houses around that central group, which I think many of us interpret to be a single family unit, although there are variations in how people may interpret that.
Yeah, thank you. Just reminded me, I was working to help an economist create a survey to study households in the region where I worked, and it was very frustrating because he wanted to have single household for a single family, and that wasn't the case. But I see how the plazuela really sort of helps to disarticulate that a little bit. Thank you. We had another question from, yeah, okay, great.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was curious, as you see in the chat, how house size kind of became the common denominator, just thinking about indigenous people's worldviews about the functions of homes and how, like in Diné culture, a hogan is all just one unit, and it's, having a small house size doesn't necessarily mean you don't have wealth. So just curious about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent thing to bring up in terms of how our modern societies may help inform our interpretations of the past. One of the reasons why we are using house size is because it creates a large enough data set to do a study like this. If we're only looking at, say, artifacts, that is dependent on how many houses you were able to excavate, the size of those excavation units, where those excavation units were located, versus house size we can get at through settlement survey and through things like remote sensing, especially with the advent of LIDAR or just satellite imagery in other places like the US Southwest, where you can sometimes see these sorts of features on the landscape. So house size is commonly used because it creates a robust enough data set to really see these differences within these different units, in this case, classic Maya polities. So that's a great idea, though, that sometimes house size is not always the best indicator, as you gave with the example of the 𝗔Ｈ𝗫𝗍𝗃.
Thank you.
Amy, I have a question. When we look at modern communities, villages in particular that are agrarian and use low levels of modern technology, we see that that these households or plaza groups are multi-generational families living in the same place. So and they actually grow over time from their initial settlements. They, one individual, one nuclear family becomes parents, become grandparents, and their children expand those to be larger living areas. So what do you think the relationship is, comparing these to the past of the axis of time and the idea of, intergenerational families living in a single plaza area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the way that we best interpret that is that oftentimes the largest household, it does tend to be the earliest household. We know that based on some previous work that we have done, that the earliest households develop into the largest households with statistical significance. And then, like we saw with the maps that have the different colored dots of size, often those largest households are surrounded by smaller households, which we interpret to be generations of families choosing to live next to their kin.
Any other questions?
If I can pose a quick question to follow up on that, because Amy, the question also arises out of Tiffany's comment. How then do you take that that sort of developmental, sort of social history side from the examples in southern Belize and the classic Maya area, and then compare it? What's your confidence in comparing those kinds of developmental histories in other regions of Mesoamerica, or as some other folks have begun to do in these sort of broader cross-cultural kinds of comparisons?
So you're asking how we can use the occupational sequences of these houses to look at inequality through time?
How are you inferring the various contributing parts to these extended family histories and land tenure and house size and relative robustness of that data for inequality measures?
Okay, so I think that we have some houses that are very well dated in our data set in southern Belize, and so being able to know that some of these houses existed here early on the landscape, and that those houses are often distributed across the landscape. And at Uxbenká, you saw that they were distributed, but all along that trade route, but they weren't all close together right by each other, but that they had several hilltops between them that people could have been continuing to expand out upon. Another aspect is that I did not do a diachronic analysis of the house size, in part because we don't know how big when the oldest and largest houses date to, we don't know how big those houses were during the early classic. We're only seeing the manifestations of them at the late classic period. So being able to say how were these, how is house size specifically changing over time has a lot of challenges that I have chosen not to address because I can't figure out the house size of these, like during the early classic period, for example. So.
Thanks. there's always more to do.
Yes, always, always.
I've got another question that's a little bit orthogonal to what you were talking about in the talk, but I'm kind of curious about it because next week in a seminar I'm teaching on language and environment, we're reading something about houses and language and environmental practice and orientation. So I'm curious about if there are any patterns that you noticed in the settlements about how houses are oriented, or is there any pattern, or is it just sort of I don't know, is it all oriented to the plazuela, or are there any environmental features that are cued in there? Just curious if there's anything about that sort of built dimension of their orientation and sort of geometry of the houses that stuck out to you that might not have been, you know, interesting for looking at inequality, for example, but.
So in southern Belize, it's in most of the sites that I was talking about are in upland regions. And so houses are on these kind of discrete hilltops. So in terms of their orientation, that is influenced in part by the orientation of the hilltop. So it's easier to expand a hill in one direction than in another direction. So sometimes we see households that are, you know, classic Maya tend to have kind of these cardinal direction orientations, but that doesn't always hold true at the household level, in part because the houses are on, you know, the hilltops that are available. At other sites in the Maya region, I'm going to highlight the site of Cacao. They have examples of, in household clusters, the easternmost building is almost always used as a residential shrine. We don't see that trend in southern Belize as far as I've been able to tell, but in other parts of the Maya region, they have been able to tease out a little bit more about the directionality and how that relates to the households. I just haven't seen anything that really sticks out in southern Belize. In the monumental core architecture, large temples tend to be located either on the north or on the east. But in terms of households, that trend, I haven't seen anything that's quite as.
So it sounds like would it be correct to assess that as in the places where there's more inequality and there seems to be more of the sort of larger scale architecture, that you see more cardinal orientation, and then in the smaller, more I guess egalitarian, you know, according to this particular measure, places that it's more intrinsic to the local topography.
I think
Is
I
that
can
a fair
say
assessment?
that for southern Belize, I think that is something I would be willing to agree with. I'm not going to say for the general Maya region, but for where I have been doing my research, generally north, south, and kind of east, west is really important. And we can see big architectural differences, especially in the monumental core, but those don't always play out to the household level. Again, just for Uxbenká and 𝗭liche Kuku'il, I haven't looked at that enough at the other sites in southern Belize or greater Maya region, although other scholars definitely have looked at those things.
That's really interesting. It's interesting to me because the linguistic studies of Maya actually suggest that the spatial orientation is not oriented to north, south, and east and west as much as it is to the intrinsics of specific objects or landscape. You know, compared to language like Aymara that's north, south, east, and west, and you see houses that are always oriented in the same direction. And so you know, the language that Maya today is very different from what it was at the time when you're studying as well. But that just seems like an interesting thread there. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
I think one popped up in the chat.
Oh, right, yeah. From T, were overall district wealth adjusted for in the different regions or only house sizes?
So for districts, I only looked at districts at Uxbenká and 𝗭liche Kuku'il because that's where I am familiar with where these kind of nested communities exist. I suspect they exist at a couple of these other sites, but I didn't break it down into those. So for Uxbenká and 𝗭liche Kuku'il at the district, I only looked at house size within those districts. I hope that answers the question, T. Well, thank you all for, if there aren't any more questions, I just want to say thank you all for listening, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk at the UNM Anthropology Colloquial Lecture Series.
Thank you very much for your talk. And please, I hope you all will join us next week for 𝗭ecie𝗹𝗹𝗆𝗆𝗆's talk in the colloquium series. And thank you all, and I'll disconnect now and have a nice weekend.